Assalamu alaikum everyone. Apologies for the slightly late start. We just needed to pray Maghrib over here for those of us who are present. So apologies for those who are online, who are coming to us from different parts of the world. It's just that our start time coincided with Maghrib Salah as well, so we needed to make sure that we prayed. Tonight's In Conversation, welcome to you all, first of all. Tonight's XPressO In Conversation is So I Found Someone to Marry, Now What? And follows on very much from our In Conversation evening that we had last month, which covered Why Can't We Get Married? There are many areas for us to discuss this evening, and very deliberately we've changed the style of the In Conversation ever so slightly. Last time round we had a panel, and all of our In Conversations thus far have had a panel. But tonight we really wanted to make sure that we opened it up to audience, and we opened it up to everybody to take part in the conversation. And for that reason, we decided not to go with a panel at all. This evening, we will be looking for the audience, both online and here in person, to join into the conversation. And inshallah, I have Sister Sarah, who will be handing around the mic to the sisters as and when you guys need to speak. And Brother Ahmad over here, who will be passing the mic around over to the brothers. There are a number of areas that I want to cover, and these do not limit the discussion that we have tonight. But they are guidelines as to where we go with the discussion. The first of the areas that I'd like to be looking at is, how do you know that the someone that you found is the right someone? And that leads on very much to the second part of the discussion, which is, what is the right way to get to know somebody? What is the appropriate way to get to know somebody? Because often this can be a huge barrier, even in sisters and brothers that are looking to get married, is determining what is the right boundaries, inshallah. The next topic, and one which usually brings up a whole heap of discussion, is getting your parents on board, or off board, depending upon whose choice it is, whose choice the partner is anyways. The next, and then we will be moving on to a marriage contract, and what it is that we should be thinking about when we think about a marriage contract, whether we should have one, what it should contain, where we should go to put it together. And finally, and often not considered to be the final thing in this whole process, but usually the main thing in the whole process, is the wedding. What do we think about when we're doing the wedding? So I'm going to start off the discussion. I'm going to open up the discussion. So you found someone. How do you know that that someone is the right someone? What are the things that you're looking for? See, put his hand up. There's one couple that I know who made the decision to get married, even though they lived on separate sides of the world, in 5 conversations. They had 5 conversations. 5 conversations later, they made the decision to get married. And then there's another couple that I know that 2.5 years in are still trying to figure out whether or not they are the right people. Is time a factor? Yeah, Bismillah.
I think I think one important thing that usually shows up, I think is pretty strong indicative, is like how well they can communicate, and normally for me, for example, that shows up a lot with the pace of the conversation itself, or the rhythm of the the way the person speaks, and kind of the flow, the speed of the communication itself.
See, I'm just going to sit here in silence because it doesn't really make a difference to me. You can't come to In Conversation and not converse. So, and just before we began this session, Shafra said, "You're the moderator, do what you like." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm in a mean mood tonight." And he went, okay, no, be nice. So, because he realizes what I'm like when I'm in a mean mood, but I'm still, halfway there. So, you guys have got to come. Okay. Walaikum salam. Sidi, you might have to put it just a little closer.
I think it goes back to what I read in one of the articles that you posted as a reader.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a matter of defining your condition and what is a condition and what may be something that's not necessarily a condition.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, she has to be religious, but then what does that really mean? Does it mean that she prays 5 times a day? Does it mean he prays 5 times a day? Does it mean she wears hijab? Does it mean he has a long beard? Does it mean he prays Jummah, etc., etc.? And a lot of these questions were actually, alhamdulillah, on that website, survives.com. I think if people read that and use some of those questions as their defining criteria, it'll make the process a lot easier.
Just as a matter of interest, do we find criteria as acting as barriers in this process? Too many criteria, too few criteria?
Assalamu alaikum. I'm not sure what you really mean by being a barrier, because I saw that list of questions. I'm nowhere near this process, but just thinking of what that entailed, it was a little too formal, and if I were to come out and ask even 10 of those questions within, say, my family or something, they'd shoot me down. Like, what's wrong with you, sort of thing. So how do you? I guess that would be the barrier for me personally. But then, is there a better way to ask those questions? If somebody would, expound on how those questions should be asked, because I'm not entirely sure coming out in the open with those questions would work for some of us.
Explain that a little bit more. What do you mean coming out in the open?
In the sense that those questions are a little, kind of forward and formal.
Uh-huh.
So it's like you're establishing a business contract rather than a marriage contract when I read through that list. So is there a better way to ask those questions, or are those...
People ask the questions, right? Is she... Hopefully she's making the tea, but when I was getting married, a certain somebody, I won't mention who, even asked me, like, do I know how to stitch? Like, could I, stitch a button if it broke off the shirt? I'd been in scouts, so I could. I've never done it since I got married, except once unsuccessfully. I also got asked, what would you do? Because we're going to, if we got married, we're going to move to 30 Charles Street, the married students' residence at U of T. So actually, I was asked by a certain someone that, what would you do if a really big person was going to run after me? Number one, I'm lazy. I'm not about to beat up any big person. Right? The only experience I've had with fighting was in judo. I don't know. I think the judo guy had it in for me, because I was a person he kept flipping upside down and throwing on the mat. So I quit judo. Right? I'm not really, besides with Nadir, I'm not really a violent person. So I got asked pretty frank question. What do you do if a big guy was running after me? So I thought about it. I said, well, I tell you which way to run. So people ask, honestly, all kinds of questions, right? So, but I think the only problem is that people are often confused about which questions to ask, right? And that's why I think you guys have to think about this, right? And one thing that happens is when people get nervous, like what question should I ask? They ask the strangest questions, right? Like, what video games do you like, right? Seriously, I've just dealt with actually more than one set of people been discussing what video games do you like, and the big life questions they haven't really asked about. So you pick on some sisters now.
I've just been told I can pick on sisters. Okay, so this is a really easy one for the sisters, right? Because this is always an easy one for the sisters. What criteria do you have to determine someone is the right someone? Come on, nobody knows who you are. Sisters, you're letting down the side here.
Okay, I'll say something just so that somebody says something. But I mean, obviously, I guess if you think about like what kind of lifestyle you want to live, or how you imagine, you know, your life as a married couple, like what you expect out of your husband in terms of, you know, his career, or like what he's going to be doing all day. And if you have certain goals that you want to accomplish, I feel that as a woman, you're going to be a mother, you're going to be a wife, but you obviously want to do whatever you want to do in life too. So some criteria that you should think about, I think, is, you know, is his idea of what his life is going to be like match with what you want to do in your life.
Okay. You see, that would worry me slightly, and I'm bringing it back to you a little bit, because that sounds like you're asking about what you want your life to be, as opposed to what your life is. And, you know, I may want my life to be a 5-bedroomed house with a luxury car, but can't be bothered to get out of bed in the morning to go to work. Does that tell me that the person is the right person for me, if that's what he envisages his life to be? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Like, obviously, realistically, where you are right now, where he is right now, is really important. But I think more so than just about like your standards, or because you never know what could happen. Like, you know, anything can happen to anybody. But what's really important to you, and like, do those kinds of goals match up with that person?
Okay.
And that you could, like, if you know that now, that's helpful, because you have a clear kind of understanding of what you want. But if you don't know, then do they seem like they're on the same page in terms of where you both would want to be?
Okay. I think we have a brother that...
Alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Related to a question that people get asked, one of the criteria questions, are you religious? Are you religious? And so, how does one answer, this is more a question for Sheikh Faraz, I believe. How do you answer that? Like, yes or no? I mean, if you say yes, then that implies a lot of things.
Okay.
So that's a good question, right? So this is taking it to some of the religious criteria, right? That if someone asks you, are you religious? How do you answer? Right? But I think that there's two parts to this, right? The first is when people wonder about someone else's religiosity, right? If you're asking the question, are you religious? You're begging for a useless answer, right? Because what's someone going to say? No, I'm not, right? Or yes, they're presumably trying to get married, so they're not exactly going to tell you an honest assessment. They're going to try to give you a favorable assessment, right? So how do you, if you do base your decision on, you're looking for someone religious, how do you find out that they're religious?
Mhm.
ask about.
How do you find out that they're religious? Any of the sisters?
I guess just asking around, see what kind of person he is, friends, people I know in the family.
Yeah.
Somebody else was going to answer over here.
Ask specifics. You can start asking specific questions. So, yeah, and those specific questions could be, do you pray 5 times a day? And do you strive to perform your 5 pillars? Are examples of questions that I would ask.
Okay.
How else do you find out about someone's religiosity?
Their activeness in the community,
Their
MSAs, school organizations, community organizations. If you see someone, frequenting these kind of places, it's safe to assume that, inshallah, they are on the right path, or at least on their way to the right path, and trying to and striving to be a religious practicing person.
I think beyond those, though, you might want to see how they treat, how do they treat their parents, how do they treat others around them, how they treat their friends, who their friends are. I think for me it comes down to those aspects, like behavior and how they act with others, and kindness and service, as opposed to whether they pray.
Yeah, it's fine. I'll just leave them.
No, go on.
Isn't it more of accepting the fact that every single person has their own subjective definition of what they're looking for as far as religiosity is concerned, instead of one universal definition? Like, how can you say, like, how do you define practicing Muslim or not practicing Muslim, religious or not religious? And that definition differs from person to person. And the question would be, what are you looking for? Like, what are your deal breakers? What are you willing to settle for? What are you, what is the bare minimum you're looking for? And that will differ from person to person.
Do most people know what they're looking for when they say that I'm looking for someone religious? I see a lot of nodding heads, but yeah.
I think that people often fantasize about this idea of religiousness and religiosity. I think people have this, ideal of a scholar-to-be type husband, and sometimes that's very problematic, because that way of thinking may prevent you from getting married to a really great brother who may not be, a scholar in the future, or Allahu Alam, who might be. But I think we do tend to fantasize about this idea of religion and religiosity, when we really should focus on practical things on a practical level.
What do you mean by practical things?
For example, people tend to think about, or may want to consider, someone who is willing to go abroad overseas for Islamic knowledge, but they really don't think about the ramifications of such a thing. If they were to think to themselves realistically, would I be someone who is willing to locate with this person in the future if their desire is to seek sacred knowledge? Or am I someone who's going to be out here in the West, and this is where my job is, my career is, this is where I plan to be. So I think a lot of times we don't consider what we really want, but it's easy for us to say, oh, I want my life to stay the way it is, but I still want that religious person. Yet they're not taking into consideration the fact that that religious person
is going to have their own goals and desire to do things that may not exactly sit well with what your current situation is or what your plans for the future are. So we need to, I think, step back from this ideal, from this fantasy of a religious person, and just, you know, maybe narrow down our expectations.
But that fantasy, does it come from understanding what it means to be religious?
I don't think so.
Like, what is being religious?
I think that's something we need to define for ourselves.
No, but there is an objective definition, right? What is deen, for example, right?
Simplicity. I think
That's
we need to-
that's an interesting definition.
I think when people say they're looking for a religious person, they want somebody that does the outward actions of Islam, that they don't do anything that's haram, they don't persist in doing things that are makruh, they pray, they fast, they do these types of things. They don't have, they're not going to ask, do you get it for a tahajjud, or have you memorized the Qur'an? Well, they may ask,
But I think what Ifat mentioned before is very significant, right? That, you know, what is religiosity, right? That if someone prays 5 times a day and, you know, they do right things and they avoid wrong things, is that religiosity? Is that religiosity itself? Right? Because that feeds what was mentioned about, you know, people having these fantasies, right? Whether it's the scholar fantasy or it's the activist fantasy, right? MashaAllah, she's so active, you know, I'll be really happy with her. But if she's really active and she's maybe hyperactive and she's never home, then, like, you know, they say it's like the deaf guy, you know, at the party, right? You don't know what people are dancing about, right? Because you don't hear what they're dancing, you know, why they're dancing, right? So, like, what is religiosity?
Sure. Thanks. So this is actually a very interesting question. It kind of stumped me at the beginning when you asked, are you religious? Well, what does that mean? That's a great question. And now that I think about it, it's a very big question. You're like asking someone, prove existence, or prove that you exist. It's a very big question. And I think the way I approach this question is, number one, is actually through a criteria, right? So I start by kind of knowing who I am, what I want in life. The process begins with me. And once I know myself, then I create a list of criteria, which, if I'm a Muslim, would be driven by that foundation. That, okay, I'm a Muslim, so I am looking for, you know, these 15 must-haves and these 11 nice-to-have qualities. And that would be my definition of a religious person.
There's a problem with that, though.
Which is?
Like, if you look at a selection pool, right? So Zubaydah is looking to get married, right? Because she gave up on Zubayr, right? Because he'll never propose to her dad. So Zubaydah is looking to get married, so she starts making criteria. Right? She says he should know 2 juz of Qur'an. So that's reasonable, because she grew up in a religious family, so she knows like 5 juz, so 2. She'll, you know, these young guys, you know, she's now 31, so, you know, these young guys. But then that automatically excludes everyone who knows 1.5 juz of Qur'an. And the guy with 1.5 juz of Qur'an is not necessarily less religious than the one who knows 2.5. Right? And then you say, oh, he has to get up for tahajjud. Maybe this person just is like Sayyidina Abu Hurairah. Maybe they're physically weak and they struggle to get up for tahajjud, but they may be like all that, right? So what is religiosity?
So I have a sort of a related question though. because someone can paint themselves to be Mother Teresa, but they're not. And actually, we had.
That's good because then they're probably Muslim.
Well, yeah, but that would help. But we've had like online as well. Will you really know you have married the right person? Will you really know you've married a religious person? Or does that only happen until after you've got married? And then an additional. I mean, anyone can look like the second coming of Sheikh Faraz prior to getting married.
That was dangerous. People were really worried for Shireen Fatima Ahmed because, I'm like, I used to write for the Muslim Voice. Someone put a tagline, and they said it's ghiba, but I celebrated it. They said Faraz Rabbani is like a Gulf War Scud missile, lots of energy, but a terrible sense of direction. So now actually we've complicated things, right? Because there's two issues, right? One is that, let's say, presumably we want to marry for deen, right? So the first question that, is not entirely clear is what is deen, right? What is deen? And deen could refer to different things, right? Because if you're getting into business with someone, what is the relevant aspect of deen with respect to getting into business partnership with someone? What would the relevant part be?
I would guess somebody that doesn't lie or cheat.
Yeah, someone who doesn't lie or cheat, someone who's trustworthy, right? So that's the relevant deen when it comes to entering into a business partnership. The fact that they get up for tahajjud is really cute, right? But that's not what your marriage, what your business partnership depends on, right? So when you're marrying someone, the fact, actually if you think about it, the fact that they're active in the MSA and they're going to be hyperactive with the, the Islamic hub of North America, right, or whatever, right? That's not necessarily a positive because it could actually be detrimental to the marriage. What is the relevant criteria? That's number one. Number two, how do you go about finding out about the person, right? How do you go about finding out? Because a lot of people, they deem their religiosity, they go on Sister Zubaida's, what was Zubaida's last name?
Zubair. No, Zubair.
Her last name. Yeah, Zubaida Khan. So, Zubaida Khan, her Facebook profile is like Deen perfect, right? She's got the Celebrate Mercy banner. She's got like little announcements about Seekers Hub. She promotes, what else? Zaytuna, every Zaytuna talk is up on her site. All her photos are from Seekers Hub and MSA and RIS and Peter Gould. Right? So she's also refined, mashallah, high pace. Oh, that might be worrying because expensive. And and you ask, are you religious? And you say, yes, I do tahajjud sometimes. Oh, good. That's it. It's the gold standard, right? Is that a fair assessment?
No.
So let's try to hit this on its head because it's very important. What is deen?
Good character. That's the number one thing, I think. How will you know Zubaida's character just from what she posts online? That's
Yeah. If you get to know the person, is that helpful? If you, let's say you have 10 meetings with the person, can you judge their character?
No.
If someone
If you have 10 meetings with them, you can judge their character as far as meetings go.
you can judge their character as far as
Meetings go.
meetings go. Could you expand on that?
Well, it's not going to show you, like, are they going to be able to handle difficulty? Are they going to help out a stranger? Because you only see them in this limited context. So you're not going to have an overall picture. It's going to be a very narrow view. And you're only going to learn certain things that can be learned through a meeting.
Just to add to that, with their best foot forward in those meetings, of course, right? I think everyone could.
Yeah, so that they'll put their best foot forward. And you really care about their best foot? No. You care about their back heel, right? When you annoy them, they give you the back heel, right? So then how do you find out?
And what is the appropriate way of finding out, Julie?
How do you find out about someone?
Get them mad.
I think one, I guess, very good way of doing it. So I think one way is if, for example, if you know that the sister is involved with or known by like an ustada or a sheikha in the community or a sheikh's wife, like you could ask about her, or if she has a sheikh, you can ask the sheikh about her. Somebody who knows her very well on that spiritual, religious level.
So someone that, to ask about the person from someone who knows them at a spiritual level. But what if they just show up at events, right? They don't really get to know the scholars, whatever. So they go to Ustada Shireen and she says, well, I've just seen her at some hub events, I don't really know her. And no one else knows her. So how do you find out about...
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think the best thing to do is just ask family. Because they know the person very well, and if they're honest with you, they'll eventually tell you what type of person they are when they're angry, when they're happy, and overall their whole personality. Because when you're with a group, or when you're with your friends, you act differently, of course, right? But with family, they know your bad side and they know your good side.
So to ask the family.
Yeah.
But is there a downside to that?
Answer.
It's okay, I was just in the middle.
Because they can.
I was gonna say because they can lie, or they can just be like, I like you and I want my daughter to marry you. Then I'm just gonna tell you that she's the best girl ever. So I guess that's just.
So family may not necessarily be sincere
but then
to
again,
you.
it could be.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up, that the family, if they like you and they want you to get married, then they're going to give you a really good picture, and they may try to hide things about the person. So if you do get advice from the family, maybe also get advice from their enemies, somebody who isn't afraid to tell you straight up, I don't like this person because of such and such and such.
I think.
Okay. It's sometimes about the friends you keep too. So, you always judge a person's character by their friends sometimes. So, obviously, their friends are someone whose their character is something that you would not want to be around. Then probably they're not the right person for you.
Yeah, so there's a few. Sorry, there's a few, because I'm trying to hit something on the head. There's a few things that have come up. One is that really, you can't really find out that much from getting to know the person. Right? And to be honest, you could have spent a great deal of time with someone and have no clue about how they are, because they'll put their. It's like if you ever done theater, right? You'll go there in a costume, right? You're not going to dress shabbily if you go to have dinner, in whatever manner of halalifying that encounter, right? So you do it you meet at Hero Burger and you make sure that Talha is there as well, right? So Uncle Talha, so that so everything stays halal. But you're just going to present your good face, right? So it's important to take other means of finding out, which would include, asking people who know them. It might be their family, right? Because their younger brother, and yet the younger brother will tell you everything about his older sister, right? Or it could be, other people who know them well. It could perhaps be a scholar, if that applies. another key thing is what the sister mentioned, that it's look at the person's friends. Like, look at the person's friends and how they are. Right? Because that gives a lot of insight as well. But the issue does still remain that what does deen mean? Right? What is deen? That what really are you looking for? Right? And that, we leave that for you to ponder about, and go to some of the resources that we shared, right? Because most, just in last 10 years of dealing with people's questions with regards to marriage, I've rarely met someone who gets what deen is, right? Rarely met. The vast majority of religious Muslim men, they summarize the woman's religious practice in the fact that she wears the hijab, right? And and women maybe similar kind of thing. So we have to look very carefully as to what the consideration is there.
Most people, when they are looking to get married, we're like, none of us are angels. We're not perfect. We have a lot of flaws. So maybe something that's a little bit more useful is not like, do they have these certain things, but do they not have certain things? Like, you wouldn't want them to get angry. Maybe that's a little bit easier to kind of judge, as opposed to like, other qualities of character. But in general, like, we all are still striving to become better people. So, how do you know, like, are they mature enough, or do they at least meet like a bare minimum, I guess, or how do you judge that?
So before moving on to the next point, the criteria of deen, the Prophet ﷺ really made things, part of his being a mercy, right, is that he made things easy for us, right? So you don't need 15 criteria for deen, right? The Prophet ﷺ summarized it in one definition. What is deen? Is nasiha. What is nasiha? It's sincere concern, right? Or if you say it in one word, what is deen? Sincerity is simpler than sincerity. It's a 4-letter word. Right? Religion, deen is to care. Right? Religion is to care. Right? That they care. They care about Allah, and they care about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. Right? That is deen. It is true that there's certain minimum criteria that are needed. If you're trying to live a religious life, you're trying to be someone who prays 5 times a day. If the person next to you is snoring away every day for Fajr, it's not really going to be a facilitated factor for you, right? And it's, care is manifest in conduct, right? But that's what you need to be trying to ascertain, that they care, right? That they care. Good character is a manifestation of caring, right? So you need to look at, that's what you really need to look at. That there's certain things that need to be in place, like a certain basic religiosity, but the most important thing is that they care. And that care is manifest in the way they conduct themselves, right? So that's something that really, after this, just go back and reflect on that. And we gave certain readings related to that. Really pay attention to that. Like, what is deen? And the greatest manifestation of that is those aspects of good character, right? Those aspects of good character. And those are the things that you're trying to ascertain about them. It doesn't really matter whether they get up for tahajjud or not, right? That's a plus, but that should never be a condition. The key is, do they care? And you cannot find that out just yourself. You could observe some of it, but you do really need to find that out, right? And the final thing is the point that was raised about worldly compatibility. That there's certain things that are important to you. You need to find out if those are shared or accepted. So you need to find out if you are very serious about being part of you're part of the Scouts. So every Sunday you're going to go, you do hiking for the scouts, right? So that's very serious. So it's worldly things that are important to you. Find out about them. So we'll figure that out after. No, you find out beforehand, right? So those are, I think, the main things before we move on to the next topic. But don't complicate the decision-making process. Right? Don't complicate the decision-making process, because the more criteria you make, the worse decision that you're going to have. She can't be taller than me. What if she is? Big deal, right? She has to have memorized a juz of Qur'an. Doesn't mean you're more religious, just means you know more Qur'an, right? So be careful about how you define your criteria, right? And omit all useless criteria. She has to be younger than me, and my wife's older than me, right? She has to be less than 31. What if she's 32, right? He has to be less than 40. All these kinds of things that are irrelevant, right? So look carefully into those, and we'll move on, inshallah, to the next part.
So what we wanted to move on to now is, so you've figured out, or you've tried to figure out whether or not you're marrying the right person. But then it comes down to the agreement, the actual marriage agreement. And just out of interest, I'd be really interested to know how many people here would consider, before marriage, putting in place a marriage contract.
Sorry, could you just clarify?
So how many of you would consider putting in place a marriage contract, a written marriage contract with your partner? I'm not talking like the nikah thing that you sign. I'm talking like what in Western terminology I guess you'd call a prenup, but an agreement, a marriage contract, an agreement between husband and wife. How many people here would consider putting that into place? That's pretty good, actually. It's more than I expected. Go.
Can you define what constitutes a contract?
Oh, well, I
An
can't.
agreement. Let's call it agreement. The contract is like the nikah nama.
Okay, so an agreement.
Yeah, so what things are part of it? What does it constitute? What makes up the contract? Can you stipulate you have to work, I don't have to work, you have to do cover OSAP, my OSAP, your OSAP, all bank loans. Your income is my income, but my income is my income.
I like that
4
one.
kids, 5 kids. Retirement at 45. My parents will live with me if my eldest brother passes away. Your parents will not live.
You don't
with
have to
us.
tell us about your contract.
I'm just getting started. So a little bit more clarity, because these are individuals that may not have the contact.
Well, Sally, if you want to come in.
I actually learned about this a while back in a course on the fiqh of love and marriage, and it was one of the most recommended things to do, especially nowadays here in the West. A big one that was mentioned in that class was, for example, it's something that really protects women for the most part, and one of them was, a lot of women had concerns that when they get married, they can't have kids or something like that. So the husband would often, think about remarrying again. And what they taught in that course was, you have the ability to write anything you want in that marriage agreement. You can say to your husband prior to even getting married that, regardless of whatever the situation is, you cannot remarry again. Or anything personal, anything that you have a condition that you do not want, you will not budge on whatsoever. That's up to you to make, and I think it's a great idea. It's just a safety net for women to fall back on, and for men.
So the sisters want to know, and they whispered it. How do the brothers feel about that?
I'd be very open for the idea, because I think, at least speaking from my perspective, I'm not sure about the brothers here. I think that an agreement beforehand would reduce a lot of the fantasies that people have about marriage, at least from the brothers' perspective.
It kind of safens like the whole situation for the women, like for the girl. That what if this might happen later on, and like a man can easily walk away and get married or something else, but a lot of problems come up to the sisters that what if this happens, what am I going to do? So in the contract, it's kind of like a safe side for both of them, and then it's a better way to know each other. Like if they're having a contract beforehand, they're putting things down that if this happens, what would you do then? So it kind of clears it out for both of them, and then they kind of really know before getting into the nikah that is he the right one.
Can we speak on the issue of cultural influence? So if we talk about the role of culture in a marriage, what are the expectations defined by parents? Are parents saying that they want a Gujarati speaking, barefoot and pregnant kind of wife, that they then look at the marriage contract and say, well, beta, we don't agree with this marriage contract because it doesn't stipulate X, Y, and Z about the culture. Does the couple then say, okay, we're making the decisions based on the marriage that we have? Or does a marriage encompass everyone that sits at your marriage table, like your in-laws, your extended family, your imam, your...
Okay. Culture of marriage.
Well, that complicates things, right? They say your ideals come crashing on the rocks of reality, right? Having a marriage agreement is really critical, right? Because the purpose of agreements is not to define what we agree upon, that we know we agree upon. I marry you, no kidding. That's what the whole topic's about, right? But rather to define the things that you may disagree upon, right? And why is this important? Because we have very different, the range of expectations going into a marriage, are very varied now. People have different backgrounds, different expectations, different interests, etc., and we're, in flux. So defining these critical things between the couple is very, very important, right? Because not everyone wants to have a child right away. Many people, for example, many women will want to work, but many husbands, they'd like to, they want their wife not to work, or for example, if they have a kid, for the first year, they have differing expectations that could lead to disagreement. Who does the money belong to? Practical, financial matters, and so on. So it's very, very important to have discussed those things beforehand, and that actually helps in the practical aspects of the worldly choice, right? Because there's an ideal that you want a good companion to the akhirah. There's a person you'll be living with in this life. So having, and some of the questions that are asked, you've already decided, okay, this is a suitable person for me, but to go through those issues. Now, ultimately, the marriage is about the couple, but one has to be aware here how one will deal with the two sets of parents. But defining the marriage agreement helps with that as well, because it can help define what will our relationship be with our respective parents, right? Because that can be a source of great tension. So really, having a marriage agreement and that one goes through, and that's practical, right? That's practical, that deals with the things that you could differ upon, and you should know, and the resources and so on. Discuss common things that people differ upon, because and I think perhaps we might need like a working committee like having a couple of people to help define, look at what are the best examples of suggested items in a marriage agreement, because I've seen very little practical material out there for that. So if people want to volunteer for that, we can talk after. But to just give people clear guidelines, what are the kinds of things that need to be discussed. So having that is really, really important, because when people don't know what to put in it, people put some of the most spectacularly useless things in their marriage agreement. Like, honestly, I sat through, and the marriage failed miserably. 12-page marriage agreement. I kept dozing off because there was like 60 people in a small room, and they're going on and on about nothing. They're talking about, we agree that we'll help each other do the dishes, right? Which is nice, but that's not like going to cause big fights, right? And we agree to be nice to each other and caring and loving. And no kidding, we plan to do boxing each day, right? So you should know what kind of things need to be stipulated, right? So that's marriage agreement. Just have it, right? Just have it.
Are there absolute musts in a marriage agreement that you would recommend?
Absolute musts. Property and ownership is critical. Right? Property and ownership. Because in most jurisdictions now, like for example here in Ontario, but in much of the states, although it differs, I think, from state to state, there's common property law. Right? That everything, all wealth acquired during the marriage, goes 50-50. But what would the typical husband say if there's divorce impending? Right? And let's say if he's a primary earner, what would he say? It's all mine because I paid for it. And what justification would they seek? That property rights in Islam, they're very sacred. Like, a woman's property belongs to her and it's hers, husband. So how do you deal between that and the law? Right? But say, well, and it leads to disputes all the time. Actually, even when it doesn't lead to divorce, they'll argue about it, and then in marriage there's stalemates. Where the couple goes and they give each other a few bloody punches, but neither one knocks the other out. So you always have a bleeding nose, but there's no knockout. And sometimes you just feel that just getting knocked out might just be so much nicer than having a broken nose all the time. Right? Because one knockout punch and you're gone, you get groggy and you move on, right? But every day, the nose is broken again. It's hurting, right? So there's all these little, oh, by the way, your car also belongs to me. Right? And he feels like, I want to go run her over, right? So those kinds of things you define, right? You define, right? That's one of the most essential, right? When will you have children? Right? Because there's always differing expectations. The wife working, for example, causes a lot of issues. Right? And also because what happens is when things go bad, people get defensive. So they'll say, no, they'll find Islamically you can't work. And he says, well, Islamically you have to be home in the evening, you can't go to SeekersHub. Says, Islamically you have to spend time with me, stop attending that class. Right? Then say, Islamically you can't take pictures because I'm the Amir in the house. And it becomes like, so you define, but some secondary things may not be significant, but those are some of the core aspects. So then you distinguish between a marriage agreement, which are general matters related to the relationship, but the other thing, and this is not really up for discussion, right? The marriage contract itself, spend time having a proper marriage contract. In the last year, I've dealt with at least half a dozen cases, and I don't do marriage, I've never conducted a marriage myself. I do advise people regarding they're getting married and stuff, where people literally are at the wedding hall and they're saying, like, I have actually in my Gmail account, I have an empty email that has a PDF of a generic marriage contract. Because actually a couple of times Imam Zaid's like texted me, said, I'm at this wedding and there's no marriage contract. Can you email me one? So just press F and forward it to him, right? It's already on Google servers, so, right? And this happened repeated. It's not just a one-off. And if you just think about how absurd it is, you spend weeks deciding on what kind of chocolate fountain you'll have at the wedding, right? And when the lights go out, presumably the fountain will stop. But you have no clarity about the marriage contract itself, and that's what safeguards your rights. So spend time finding out about it, right? And take the marriage contract very seriously. The marriage agreement is very important, but the legal relationship between you Islamically is a marriage contract, right? And know what are the parameters, and one of the most important things in there, because the contract itself is very simple: offer, acceptance, presence of witnesses, etc. One of the most critical aspects is that one needs to be able to stipulate, if you're a woman, make sure, just do it. You should have the conditional right of divorce. Right? You should have the conditional right of divorce, so that, God forbid, if things go wrong, you're able to get out of it without hassle, right? And we don't have the Islamic infrastructures right now to facilitate ready dissolution of marriage, right? And a lot of the social safeguards for, a woman's rights are not really in place. Extended family, etc. That would take care of, and act as restrainers aren't there. So it's very, very important, right? It is very important. And also we live in turbulent times, right? People change drastically, right? So what if you get stuck with someone and then there are mechanisms to annul marriage, but just like if you go to the court system, it's a lot, because you have to have due process, and due process is complicated. So that is critical. Find out about that and make sure. And if you're already married, don't get yourself divorced because you're trying to renew your marriage contract. But if you got married without the conditional right of divorce, you can renew your contract with it. Right? So I've actually never conducted a marriage except once. You know about this? I've actually conducted a marriage once. But technically it wasn't me conducting a marriage because the couple was already married. I flew to England to marry off a good friend of mine, and I did all the paperwork, and no, it's not you guys. And I was like feeling bad because I had this dream never to conduct a marriage contract. Although there's some people, if they ask, I wouldn't say no, right? I've softened up. But when the time came, after Maghrib prayer, Imam Sahib got up and started conducting the nikah without anyone asking him to. And he completely ignored the written contract. That was all that was left, was to sign it. So he ignored it. So he said, what do we do? My friend, being Afghani, was about to get upset. So I'm sitting next to the Imam to look really cool and stuff, but like I'm calm and collected. So I was telling him, look, Bhaijan, just stay calm, I'll handle it, right? So the next day, after the second day's celebration, which wasn't really a celebration, it was more like, mourning in a graveyard, in someone's living room. We just went to walk to the park, and I renewed the nikah with 2 witnesses present. Just to have that stipulation of the conditional right of divorce and so on. But so you can renew a marriage contract with additional details, right? So when you got married to Zubair, the guy was poor, so you accepted a $200 mahar, which he hasn't paid you yet. But now he's become, he's authored the next, prize-winning novel that's been turned into the first North American-produced halal movie and whatever, and he's a multi-millionaire. $200 doesn't cut it. So So you want to renew your nikah? And he's a generous guy. So he says, sure, you can renew it. Right? So you can renew. Because don't go around having like a 6-month renewal scheme on your nikah. But you can renew your nikah. You want some additional provisions. You can do that. And just find out how, inshallah. So that's something to take care of. And we have actually, the registration for it will be opening. It gets filled up really quickly because we have a limit, but there's a course on getting married on SeekersGuidance that covers, there's a complete lesson devoted to the marriage agreement and the marriage contract that details a lot of these things in much more detail. Bismillah ta'ala.
What a question about?
I'm sure you've gotten these questions many times. I've gotten them too about student loans and outstanding loans and debts and who should pay, what should pay, who pay, etc.
The basis is that debts belong to the person owing them, right? Islamically, there's no expectation that the husband would pay the wife's debts, nor vice versa, right? Each person's debts are their own, right? Each person's debts are their own, just as each person's property is their own. That's the base assumption. A beautiful example was, and there's no expectation either, right? Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's wife was wealthy, and because he was so devoted to learning the Qur'an and prophetic teachings, Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was voluntarily poor, and she accepted that. She wanted him to devote himself in that way, and she was wealthy, so she went to the Prophet ﷺ. She had a lot of money, and he was poor. She went to the Prophet ﷺ, Ya Rasulullah, if I give him from my wealth, would it count as charity? And the Prophet ﷺ said, you'd have twofold reward. The reward of charity and the reward of strengthening the relationship. But it's a purely voluntary act. It's not an expectation. It's not Islamically an expectation. And that remains. Right? But how do you balance between the religious expectation and societal norms? You do it by agreeing on these things beforehand. Right? And with debts, there's no assumption that the other person will, so if Zubair is going to go bankrupt, if Zubair doesn't pay his loan, Zubair goes bankrupt, and he can't hold it against her. Right? But practically, those things need to be discussed beforehand, and beware of what you agree to. Right? Especially if you're in America, right? We have like little loans here in Canada. I have a lot of friends who have more than $250,000 in debt from medical school or professional schools, right? And you get $250,000 debt, and your wife has $250,000 debt because you both met at Harvard Medical School or something. Right? So there's no expectation that you take on the other person's debt.
Okay, so I want to move on a little bit now to parents, and I'd like to open it up because I'd like to ask you a question. So you found the right person. You're convinced 110% this is absolutely the right person for me. What is your obligation? Is there an obligation? How do you go about getting your parents on board? Is there an obligation to get parents on board?
Is there an obligation for obedience to parents?
Sorry?
Is there an obligation for obedience to parents?
I don't know, the fiqh teacher just left.
How convenient.
Sorry, there's a brother.
I heard Chef Faraz before saying just never marry without parental approval. I remember Omar was sitting and he just looked at him and told him don't get any ideas. Something like that. He just kept repeating it. One of the political courses I remember. So
Okay, so what did you just quote Sheikh Faraz as saying?
so he said don't marry without never marry without parental approval.
Okay. do you go about getting parental approval? And this also comes back to Sister Rafaida's point earlier on about culture and the role that culture has begun to play in marriage partners.
I think we do have an obligation to our parents and obedience to them. So far as Islam is concerned, by that I mean that, you know, if Islamically what you're doing is correct and you have followed the unofficial criteria of finding a spouse, for example, if they're a good Muslim, they're from a good family, you guys have agreed and all else as well, I think that's when religion starts to trump culture, and we use Islam to our defense to get our parents' approval. So that is my 2 cents.
Sorry, yeah, I was grimacing at my phone. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
But let's simple thing, right? You found no, not you. Zubair found Zubaydah, right? But there's a problem, right? Which is that, you know, Zubair is from a very wealthy family. They live in like some nice part of Oakville, right? So they're not like extravagantly wealthy, but wealthy. And Zubaydah lives somewhere else, right? Oh, yeah, she lives on the other side of town. She lives in a rundown part of Scarborough, right? And, you know, also known as Scarberia, right? Way out there, right? And she's not from a wealthy family or a high status family. Her parents are like, you know, came from the village and worked hard, etc., but you know, never really made it yet, right? So the parents are saying absolutely not, right? So this is what happens. So Zubair's parents refuse and her parents refuse. Right? So you have Zubair and Zubaydah. They met in the library at UTM in a meeting for the Mississauga Muslim Voice, right? TMMV, right? And they both have the same interests. They look up to the same teachers, and they have the same aspirations in life. Seems like, you know, match made in heaven. But then there's dunya before the akhirah, right? And the parents say, we're going to die and we're going to go to heaven, but you're going to go to hell because, you know, you're not listening to us. So what do? The parents are refusing. What do you do about it? And they're like staunch in their refusal. Because there's ethnic considerations. In Zubair is Punjabi, Zubaydah is from Bangladesh. And both families have military backgrounds. So the parents fought against each other in the war. Right? So what do? Are they from like opposing Afghani tribes? Like what are opposing Afghani tribes? Can you name 2?
No, we were civil with each other. When foreigners are involved.
Okay. It's like Hazaras and Pashtuns.
Yeah. Tajiks and Pashtuns.
Tajiks and Pashtuns. Like pretty much any Afghani and another one, right? So we all love and respect, right? So they're not going to agree, or so it seems. What do? Anyone saying anything online?
Nope.
So what do? Now, you know, since we're learning outfit, what is knowledge? No, this is a very important question. What is knowledge? It's understanding. Yeah, very good.
What did you say?
It's to know things as they are. Right? It's to know things as they are. Right? That's is ma'rifatu shay ala ma huwa alayhi. It's to know something as it is. And why is this significant? It's significant because if the issue comes, okay, I have to obey my parents. I have to listen to my parents. Right? As a student of knowledge, in everything in life, it is not just figuring out how you wash your private parts for istinja or how you buy and sell in the marketplace. It applies to everything. You approach things from knowledge. Right? That what are the rights of my parents? That's the first thing, right? Because in order to make a judgment about a matter, then what do I do is a judgment. What do I do about this? Like, how do I convince my parents? First thing you need to know is what are the rights your parents have over you? What are the rights of parents? Right? So put yourself in Zubaydah mode if you're a sister, right? Right? You're in love with Zubayr, or you're Zubayr. You wouldn't be laughing if you're Zubayr, crying. Right? Right? Also known amongst his friends as Chota Majnoon, as Little Majnoon. Right? He started wearing red hat since he fell in love. Right? So, right? Yeah. So what do? And they're refusing. First thing you need to know, in order to analyze the situation on the basis of knowledge, right? And knowledge is like, is what is the right of your parents over you? Right? That's the first thing. And people just don't understand this point, right? What is the right of your parents over you? Sisters? It's not an exam, so you can...
So the rights over you are plenty, and I think I would say everything they have a right over you, except that which may lead you out of the way of Islam. For example, if you refuse to marry this person that you love and end up going through with what your parents suggest, you may not have a halal marriage.
So the question still arises, what is the right of your parents over you? And again, the Qur'an here defined it in different sets of one words. What is the right of parents?
To be good to them?
To be good to them, right? That is the right of parents, that you be good to them. Right? وَصَاحِبْهُمَا فِي الدُّنْيَا مَعْرُوفًا, that you keep their company in a good way in this life.
I guess to make them happy.
Can you make them happy?
Try.
Yeah, you try, right? That you try to make them happy. What are other rights of your parents? Absolute. We're talking about absolute rights. Someone mumbled something. Respect. What are other rights? Mercy. What are other rights? Money. Do they have rights? Do parents have rights over your money? No. Not legally, right? Not legally, right? And people misunderstand that because yes, the Prophet ﷺ did say, "Anta wa maluka li abik." You and your wealth are your father's. What does it mean though? Means that your father has great rights over you and he has rights over your wealth. But doesn't mean that you belong to your father and your money belongs to your father. That's not what the hadith means. Okay? So, what are the rights of your parents?
Do you have to take care of them when they get old?
You have to take care of them when they get old? Do you? Okay.
And the right to be treated with bir.
Yeah. To deal with them with bir. What is bir?
Goodness.
Yeah. Bir is goodness.
Well, no, sorry, that's what it says on there.
I didn't think you'd say goodness. Right? Bir is virtue. But what is virtue? The Prophet ﷺ defined virtue in two words. What is virtue? What is bir? And all of you have read this hadith, like probably many times. It's in the 40 Nawawi. What did the Prophet ﷺ define bir as? Two words, one concept. Al-birru husnul khuluq. Righteousness is good character. Right? So the right of your parents is that you uphold good character with them. Right? That you be kind, caring, gentle, merciful, loving, etc. with them. Right? And circumstantially, other rights may arise. Circumstantially, other rights may arise. Right? They reach old age, but your dad's a multimillionaire. He has like an army of servants. It's like my aunt, right? If every time I don't go as much anymore, but anytime I go to Karachi, I ask, how many servants do you have? This is a personal test. And every member of the household has a different answer to how many servants do you have. Right? Because and it depends how you define servants. Because, or, domestic help, if you want, because there's 5 or 6 full-time servants, and there's a bunch of part-time servants, and some of the people who work at their factory double up at work, and there's people who come and do like malish, who come and do massage, and other people who like, fiddle around with the flowers, and all these different functions. And you count the guards amongst the servants or not. And there's all the, and the driver, and all these. If you try to take care of them, they'll actually be upset because they have a whole army of caretakers, right? So certain rights are contextual. Your parents may not need your financial assistance. In their old age, they have a lot of accumulated wealth. They may be assisting you as you go from one failed business venture to another. Right? Talha Enterprise, right? Right? But this right is that you be good to them, right? And that's critical in convincing your parents, right? In convincing your parents, right? That you have a right to pursue trying to marry someone you want to marry if they're suitable and compatible. The right your parents have over you is that you be good to them. Right? Obedience is a means of being good. Right? But you don't have, obedience doesn't mean that you accept everything that they say. So they say, marry someone unsuitable. What do? They want you to, instead of Zubayr, they say, marry Kamran. Okay? Marry Kamran. Kamran's very wealthy, but the guy's not religious. You can't stand him for all kinds of reasons. Because, he's a Knicks fan. And you don't like the Knicks. Right? You grew up hating the Knicks. Or whatever worldly criteria you have. You don't want to be with Kamran. But dad's insisting. Do you have a right to refuse? Absolutely. Right? But the issue is how you go about doing that. So that's one of the keys is you need to find out how do you uphold that with parents. Okay. Is it an option to just go and marry behind their back?
But not recommended.
Yes, but not recommended.
Is it an option to marry behind your parents' back? For men, maybe?
What? Who would they marry?
Okay, is it an option? And let's put it in the context, if you got married behind your parents' back, your parents would be very upset. Is it an option to marry behind their backs?
Oftentimes that has been the case, and then after marriage the parents have reconciled and everything is all well. Especially after the birth of a child. That brings families together. So if it means avoiding a marriage that is going to be haram by their choice, then that is an option, but obviously not recommended. You should have the blessing of your parents.
You should have the blessing of your parents. Anyone disagree?
I don't disagree, but if getting married behind their backs is going to sever the relationship and it's not going to be repaired after, or that you think that, then I don't think you should marry in that case. I don't know if it would be allowed.
I also have an addition to add to that. What if you're a convert and your parents are never going to agree to you marrying a Muslim?
Okay, so what if your parents will appear that they will never agree to you marrying a Muslim? Or you're Punjabi and they'll never agree to let you marry someone who's not from the land of the 5 rivers. right?
And the best roti.
What do you do? And this is assuming that your parents care. Maybe you have parents who say, look, I don't care. My duty was to raise you till you're 18. Now you can go jump in the lake, just don't drown. Right? Right? What is your duty? And it helps to think about it this way. That, what if you have a child and they married behind your back? How would you feel? They just came to you one day and said, Mama, I am married to Joseph.
The difference, one is you never told him before that I'm trying to marry Joseph. For example, 2 years you tell the person, I want to marry Joseph for 2 years, they're not listening, and after that you go marry behind their back, or you never told them before, and you come up to them and you tell them that I married Joseph. I think it'll be 2 separate.
Yeah, one is if you didn't try to convince them, and the other you just went behind their backs. How would you feel if your child married behind your back?
I would be pretty disappointed.
Just disappointed?
Yeah, but what if it's a good man? And
You're so practical.
I can't direct.
That's good. That's really good. Right? But put some emotion into it. Right? I'll tell you, if Omar went and married behind my back would break. Right? There's few things you could do in life that would hurt your parents as much as marrying behind their backs. Right? And since we do have to close, this is a very important point, right? That Islamically, we distinguish between something being in itself permissible or impermissible in itself. That's one matter. But then acting upon it, you have to consider its consequences. So for example, legally, is it valid and permitted legally for a man to marry without his parents' approval? It is valid and permissible in itself. But this is the key point. It's in itself permissible. But in acting upon that ruling, what is the critical thing to consider? What are the consequences? In some situations, let's say your parents don't mind, right? And it could be for many. There's you can go choose. They've allowed you. But in most cases, parents would care. Even if you let's say you're a convert, I know many parents care who their child marries, right? So, but this is a critical point in everything. Very often, we just take something from a book and say this is permitted, but that just in itself, you have to consider what are the related consequences. And the obvious is not stated by the fuqaha. You have to, if your parents would be upset by your marrying without their approval, which is a general case, it is your filial duty to take all reasonable means to convince your parents before you marry, whether you're a man or a woman. If you do not do so, you are committing an enormity. It's a major sin. You have to take all reasonable means. Now, presumably, Zubaydah hasn't married 10 times before. So if she has, her dad's probably going to be really happy she found someone, right? But right? She could have a soccer team of ex-husbands, right? This is the 11th one. This is the goalkeeper, right? Or you just call him the keeper, right? But right, presumably she's not married before. So has she previously convinced her parents about someone else? Probably not. Right? So what do you have to do? If you're trying to take the means of convincing your parents and you don't know how to convince them, seek help. Right? Seek help. There's people, if you go to someone, you go to a scholar, for example, they deal with this all the time. They know how to handle these kinds of things, right? So seek help. Seek advice of other family members who might be on your side, right? Get a coalition together, right? But it is not an option to marry behind parents' back, right? And these kinds of marriages don't work. Right? People, when they marry secretly, while we're together at university, etc., it's very difficult to sustain, right? So you have to work at convincing your parents. That's not really an option, right? And if you're not sure how to go about it, consult. Number one. Number two, have a plan. Right? Have a plan. Right? Plan, like how you're going to manage to convince your parents. Right? And there's aspects related to that as well. But you have a right to pursue your rights, but you have also a duty to fulfill the rights of your parents, which is that you don't do that which would unreasonably cause them hurt. And if you want to take the step, you've tried all avenues, you want to take the step of marrying behind their back, make sure you consult someone who understands these issues. Right? Make sure you consult, and it needs to be someone who's experienced. Because you find someone, you find like someone young who studied like a couple of years overseas, but they don't have experience with these kinds of things. They may know theory, but they don't know how it's applied. So be very careful. Bismillahi ta'ala. So we're going to have to be closing. So Dr. Barna will wrap things up. But sorry I had to jump in for more than I wanted to, because there's a couple of very sensitive issues here. But I think from the last session and this, one thing that becomes manifestly clear, that marriage is very serious. Right? Marriage is very serious, and we need to prepare much more than we do. First as individuals, and second as a community. Right? Like, it's really outrageous if you think about it, that there's common issues that people should know about, that they should have discussed together before marriage. You won't find something like that readily available. Everyone needs a marriage contract. Can you just download a good marriage contract online? No. How long does it take to put one together? Like, if Taymoor worked on it for a week with consulting and stuff, could it be put together? Yeah, right? So, and we have some resources, but not everyone's able to buy it, this and that, and, so these kinds of things, we have to have private individual concern, but also concern for as a community, that are we removing the barriers between people and benefit, right? So, inshallah, so two things that we want to work on in following up from this, from the discussions. One is we want to put together a solid marriage contract, and second, we want to put together a solid marriage agreement. Right? And if you'd like to help in that process, we'll make it a SeekersHub Toronto project. Right? So, if you're online, just make dua for us. I'm not going to have Nader help in this, please. Nader's saying, can we call it marriage without barriers? That's, may Allah forgive him. So, but that's very serious, right? And that's how the believer is, right? That we should, we've talked about some of these things, but let's put together like a working team and to come up with something that we ourselves, many of you are unmarried, and this will help you, but also something that will help others, and whoever Allah is in the assistance of those who are in the assistance of others, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So Dr. Bana is going to make the closing dua, and we'll.
I was just going to do the summary, hand over to you to do the dua.
I'm going to.
Okay. All right. So you found someone to marry. Now what? Know yourself. Define what your conditions are, and make sure that those conditions come from who you yourself are. But also that those conditions are something that you can actually define and know. So religiosity is all good and well, but if it doesn't come from good character, and if it is outwardly as opposed to inwardly, then it won't be of much use in your marriage. Prepare yourself for marriage, and prepare your agreement for marriage. And in that agreement, make sure you include the sorts of things that become problematic for those people who are married and who are going through a divorce. Property and ownership, children and timings, things like whether you'll be working or not as a wife, whether or not you'll be working as a husband. Take time out to prepare your marriage contract and to focus on your marriage contract and not just the day of your wedding. And for sisters, absolutely have a conditional right to divorce in your marriage contract. Approach your marriage and your parents with good character. Be respectful to them, your parents, and recognize that getting married without your parents' consent and or behind their back is absolutely inappropriate and will probably result in a failed marriage. And finally, and this is a topic that we wanted to get onto but didn't, the wedding is just a day. The marriage is the rest of your life. If you prep for your wedding for an entire year, prep longer for your marriage. Jazakallah khairan. We'll be dropping you an email about our next XPressO event if you've registered for this one and we have your contact details. Thank you very much for joining us in person and thank you very much for joining us online. Jazakallah khairan.